A long, long time ago, on an island not so very far away, Christopher Columbus came to Hispaniola and proceeded to begin what most textbooks consider the start of U.S. history, the enslavement of natives, bringing of disease, and stealing of gold. And so begins a long, illustrious history of people coming to America, making problems, and trying to fix them, that would eventually create the 17th most free country in the world, citing the Human Freedom Index. This is a short story of U.S. history, and there's quite a lot to cover. But unlike textbooks of yore, we start U.S. history with a quick blurb of the rich and wonderful native cultures that developed before Spain decided it'd be a great idea to find more money somewhere not in Europe or Asia. They existed. There were mountain people in the Mississippi Plains, Mayans, Aztecs, Incas, the old Native American works. Now back to the white Europeans. In the early days of our glorious American history, the first important events were Europeans dominating the American market through gold, missionary work, and disease up the wazoo. Everyone from Cortez to Pizarro were popping by America to take a huge dump on it and claim the land for Spain because the Portuguese got Asia in a recent treaty. There was some resistance to the slave treatment of Native Americans, but as long as the silver kept flowing, didn't really matter. The encomienda system was too good for getting wealth, and the Spanish went right on over to get South and Central America. About a century in, from 1500 to 1600, England starts getting their church set up and finally recognizes that Spain's been getting all the good loot, and that it was high time for the English to loot some gold for the Queen. Top number 1, Jamestown. One word, mosquitoes. Good old John Smith and his pals decided that a Virginia swamp was an amazing place to build a first settlement and find some gold, which was a really pretty terrible idea. The only reason any Englishman survived was because the nearby Native Americans, led by Powhatan, traded food to them, eventually leading to the Virginia colony really beginning once they realized that 1. England has gained a large smoking addiction, and 2. America was ripe for tobacco growing. Attempt the next, Massachusetts. Pilgrims got sick of being in the Anglican Church founded by a lusty king, so they decided to go to America. And they also signed a Mayflower Compact so they didn't actually kill each other. And then most of them died in the winter. And the remaining survivors hooked up with the nearby Native Americans via Squanto translation and eventually had some kind of Thanksgiving thing before they were mortal enemies. The Massachusetts Bay Company also sends in the Puritans, aka conservative Christians, to make a, quote, city upon a hill, led by John Winthrop. Whenever people started to think, man, these guys are really freaking strict, some guys went on to found Connecticut with the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was one of the first kinds of constitution-type documents, and Roger Williams founded Rhode Island after just walking straight to Providence. And Anne Hutchinson followed before dying in Dutch New Amsterdam, which is otherwise known as New York before New York. And thus, the original group of crotchety conservatives and whiny, more liberal-minded people were established in America. Attempt the next. Maryland, haven for Catholics. Pennsylvania, haven for Quakers. New York, was Dutch, now isn't. Carolinas, split north and south, poor and rich, respectively, and Georgia, colony of the debtors. All the colonies hired slaves and indentured servants, and as time goes on, slaves lose more and more rights because they're slaves, and colonies get into more and more fights. King Philip's War versus the Indians, and Bacon's Rebellion versus the poor. With stuff getting crazy as the colony's rich continually make money off of crops and cheap labor. All the while, Spain and France are getting colonies in Texas and Canada so that they don't miss out on North American economic booty. As time moves on, mercantilism system is established for the English colonies, and England brings America into more of its wars, like the French and Indian War. Slave society is embedded into America, and John Locke says, hey, what if man could revolt against its governments if the governments are bad? Women stay at home and do chores, and everyone goes to church more often due to a great awakening. And this time of the late 1600s to the late 1800s is where America starts becoming something like America, with a middle class growing up and the colonies growing and getting more involved in English war, like I said earlier, and Benjamin Franklin drawing up an Albany Plan of Union, which was the first kind of union-type plan that also failed because we didn't really feel like it at the time. The South became more plantation-oriented, and the North became more commerce and manufacturing-oriented, beginning the two Pokemon rivals' journeys to the Civil War. On the social side, Indian attacks happen more, Salem finds witches in their midst, and women remain at home. But problems arise. England is going broke after the French and Indian War, and after having left America mostly alone for a century, they said, hey, it's free real estate. And they start throwing more taxes at America than shade at France. They put down a line of proclamation in 1763, and America reaches Freedom Rage Level 1 because they can't expand west. This then increases to Freedom Rage Levels 2 and 3 as the Sons of Liberty reform, the Boston Massacre happened, and more taxes are handed down, and impressment policies keep on stealing Americans for the English Navy. Then we reach a freedom level over 9,000 as we shot the shot heard around the world in Lexington and Concord, and the Second Continental Congress got Thomas Jefferson to write a declaration of telling England to piss off, otherwise known as the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine also wrote a common sense pamphlet to give the American people common sense and turn more people to the Patriot side, because allegiance-wise, America was more split into 1/3 Patriots, 1/3 Loyalists, and 1/3 I don't care, why are these people shooting guns everywhere? Congress then creates the terrible Articles of Confederation, and Washington bamboozles the British with French help to ensure the start of America. Stage 2. More freedom, more problems. Army officers revolt over pay, farmers revolt over taxes in the Shays' Rebellion, Indians get screwed over, and women remain at home with a new Republican motherhood system as justification. Only good thing to come out of the Articles of Confederation is the Northwest Ordinance, setting up territories. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison bamboozled the colonies into replacing it with the Constitution, where a great compromise between two plans creates the Congress as we know it and the rest of the government. Slavery is now in law with a 3/5 clause written into the Constitution, giving it actual legal credence, and Hamilton and Madison are forced to accept a Bill of Rights so that we don't have a big brother government. So, now that we have presidents, we can go off of them. George Washington is the president that set the precedents for the presidents of the present. Got it? He established a national bank because Hamilton's not throwing away his shot, and built up the U.S. Army to be slaughtered by Native Americans. He stopped us from going to France by shutting down the Citizen Genet from trying to recruit Americans for the French Revolution, and then frowned upon political parties, whereupon America started making political parties. And before he left, he also sent Pinckney to make Pinckney's treaty with Spain, opening up the Mississippi River so that American farmers could trade more. Yeet. Then John Adams came along, preventing war with France and the XYZ affair and others, and passing the Alien and Sedition Acts to be an insult to free speech, leading to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions being passed, continuing the buildup of reasons for civil war in about half a century. Very first mudslinging campaign comes along in 1800 with John Adams for the powerful federal government of Big Brother versus Thomas Jefferson for the Farmers' Republic of Whiteness, with a surprisingly peaceful transition to Jefferson's rule as president, proving that elections could work and we didn't have to kill each other to get new leaders. Wow. Jefferson, the no big government guy, comes in, and so began a whole lot of new and wonderful things. If you read his lips, they actually said no new taxes, with him repealing all taxes besides imports. And the Supreme Court said, hey, we can do judicial review now. In the Marbury versus Madison case, women are still at home and are actually being beat up a lot, and religious communities of all faiths are growing a lot. Jefferson breaks his no big government rule to buy the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon because Napoleon be going broke, and it gets explored by Lewis and Clark. And eventually we get pissed off at Britain again, and they were still mad at us. And then eventually we got pissed off at Britain again, and we did this non-intercourse act whereupon we stopped trading with our only trade partners, which didn't work out for us. And then when Monroe came into office, we got into the catfight that was the War of 1812, where nobody won and Native Americans got considerably weaker. One Adams-Onis Treaty and one Monroe Doctrine later, we have Oregon and Florida, and we told Europe to back off, even though it wouldn't really work until about a century down the road. Going into the 1800s, we have also got fancy new tech too, from the cotton gin powered by slaves to the factories in the north powered by white slaves. Steamboats, canals, roads, banks, literature, and more helped define the era of good feelings, an era where there was little political division, and the economy is starting to become more like the modern capitalist society that we all know and love. The Marshall Court hands down the law and expands its reach with cases like McCulloch versus Maryland, where they upheld the legality of the national bank, therefore approving of a larger federal government that could regulate by the Commerce Clause, which said the government regulates interstate commerce. But slavery troubles are a brewing. Missouri was only let inside the Union with a compromise forcing slavery south of the 3630 line, and the North and South were gradually getting more and more The election of 1824 happened, with a supposed corrupt bargain deciding the contested election in John Quincy Adams' favor, leading to Andrew Jackson supporters to cry foul and get him elected in 1828. JQA and Henry Clay would try to have a large federal government with an American system that would boost the economy, but it only triggered the South some more by driving up the price of literally everything. Jackson would then soon become president as the Donald Trump of the 1800s. As he came in, he started up a spoil system that would reward political supporters with jobs, even though they were much worse than old employees. But, to the victor goes the spoils, I guess. He also kicked the Native Americans out west despite a Supreme Court ruling, along a trail of tears, and collapsed the national bank, which would eventually lead to inflation and the economy getting all kinds of messed up. And he also approved a tariff of abominations that would spark a nullification crisis when some states tried to be bigger than the feds and say, "You can't do that," to which Jackson said, "Oh yes we can." The Second Great Awakening happened around this time as well, bringing more people back to church. Utopias rose and fell, while transcendentalism became the first hippie thing in America. Quick check, women are still at home or dying in factories, but so are teachers now. After Jackson comes his VP, Van Buren, who oversees some rather gnarly economic panic in 1837 and 39. His VP, Van Buren, comes in and oversees some economic panics in 1837 and 39, and Texas is becoming a thing. Wow. Skip a President Tyler or two, and we get to James K. Polk, who gets us involved in a land war with Mexico and resolves the Oregon boundary with Britain peacefully, letting many more American farmers die of dysentery on the Oregon Trail. After said Mexican land war, we get California and other stuff too, and we start to look like the modern United States of America. Manifest Destiny gets all the Americans on the hype train straight into the California gold rush, and we send some ships overseas to threaten Japan to trade with us. And they eventually trade with us because we threatened them with some large ships. Now, getting into the 1840s and 50s, women try to say that they have rights at the Seneca Falls Convention, but they still don't. And immigrants come in from Ireland and China. And slavery is starting to become more of a hot-button issue, with abolitionists becoming a thing. We get a compromise of 1850 and a Fugitive Slave Act to stop the North and South from slapping each other, along with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, with all these trying to appease to both sides. The Dred Scott v. Sanford case, Bleeding Kansas actions, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates are all driving up the sectional tension between the North and the South, with the Democratic Party and Republican Party being defined as the South/States' Rights and the North/Big Brother government parties, respectively. Lincoln eventually gets elected, the South secedes, and we all go into the sequel of The Founding Fathers, President Lincoln, Civil War. We now take a quick break for the Civil War. It happened. Your general terrors of war stuff. It was the first modern war in that we finally had a war where lots and lots of people died terrible, horrifying, painful deaths. And Lincoln got assassinated. Feels bad. Moving on to Reconstruction, after we destroyed each other to prove that federal government was supreme, a totally radical Republican Congress notices that Andrew Johnson just kind of let the South return to its old ways with new names like Black Codes, and impeached Johnson for not doing anything to change the South and trying to fire a North-friendly Secretary of War, Stanton, leading to eventually Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general, to get elected, and approve military occupation of the South to try and change things. Eventually, though progress was made on this front with the 15th Amendment allowing other races, but still not women, to vote, new schools, while being attacked by groups like the KKK, all this progress was reversed once Rutherford B. Hayes was elected, Reconstruction was ended, and African Americans were doomed to a lower class status in the South for decades to come. And America, at this point, finally stopped caring about equality again because we don't feel like, we don't feel like keeping equality going. Who do you think we are? Some kind of bastion of liberty or something? And so, Jim Crow laws become the Southern norm. While all of this is happening, the West is also becoming a thing, with the railroad expanding the American West and territories getting settled left and right. Cowboys and Indians become prevalent and then fade away again, as the cowboy trails are fenced off with barbed wire and the Indians are killed off by the government in places like Wounded Knee and herded off to reservations where no white man would live. And into the new century now of the 1900s, the Gilded Age is brought upon us, a gold-plated turd of a time. New inventions, both economic and technological, are created from the horizontal and vertical integrations of Rockefeller and Carnegie, paving the way for new monopolies to be formed and even worse working conditions to be made. New technology like telephones, electric lights, and gas engines pave the way for more modern and automobile-dominated cities, while the pull of the United States brought more immigrants to pack into the tiny apartments in the dirty, disease-ridden cities that tried to paint themselves as the place of the future. With these terrible working conditions, people started to get pretty annoyed. Labor unions for farmers like the Grange and for industrial workers like the American Federation of Labor would try to grow as a negotiating force to bring favorable prices to crops and working conditions for the common worker. And they would eventually become pretty much hated by anybody rich, and would also lead up to socialist parties and groups forming, and also being accused of communism in, later times. The Populist Party also grows from the ideas of the groups of poor and broken people, though in the South the situation remains pretty terrible for African Americans, with some Southerners also painting the South of the Civil War as a kind of lost cause that went the way of a martyr. With all these problems, of course, come a progressive response that wants to fix everything. Muckraking journalists to expose problems, the Sherman Antitrust Act and Pendleton Civil Service Act, and women's temperance movements, progressives tried their hardest to solve many issues, with President Theodore Roosevelt being the progressive president that would spearhead many progressive reforms by busting trusts and promoting the conservation of nature before the Boy Scouts existed. After he left, VP Taft quickly forgot about all the conservation stuff and signed off on increased taxes, but he did also bust more trusts than Roosevelt the Trust Buster, keeping some of Teddy's policies. After Taft came in Woodrow Wilson, who remade the National Bank as the Federal Reserve, resurrecting it from the graveyard in a tribute summon, and set up the Federal Trade Commission to be a middle finger to big companies trying to be the next Standard Oil. But wait! Now we have to remember the rest of the world exists. Ha! Roosevelt also went to Panama and got the Panama Canal started up. Some forgotten presidents got Alaska and Hawaii because who cares about them? And Wilson, or who cares about the presidents? Not Alaska and Hawaii. They're cool. And Wilson got us involved in World War I. And with that terrible atrocity of gas and new deadly technologies forcing old-school generals to rethink the whole charging into battle into death thing, America got pretty rich, leading to both the justification of limitations on free speech in war with the Sedition and Espionage Acts and the beginning of the Jazz Age in the 1920s. Only issue is, with the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, we essentially said, hey, thanks for the economic boost, now screw off, and went to have a decade-long party while Europe was left to rot in its war-torn countries and fascist uprisings. The League of Nations was created, and then screwed when the United States said, I'm not going to join this. Piss off. Going back stateside, alcohol is now obtained from your local bootlegger because it's illegal, and women can vote now, but still aren't close to equal in a socioeconomic sense. Eugenics provides a scientific basis for racism, the Ku Klux Klan releases its remastered version into the new age, and science gets a slap to the face in the Scopes monkey trial because praise Jesus. And farmers fall into an economic depression because Europe can grow its own crops again, because they're not shooting each other and getting gassed. Carried by Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, carried by the presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, the 20s were a time of illegal booze, urban economic gain, and parties, and social advancement into a more liberal kind of mind. Then America got depression and forgot to consult their economic therapist. When America went broke, it took the whole world with it, with the fascist European leaders having an even larger basis to take control, while in America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife attempted to save the country by giving it a New Deal, with many, many programs that are a great thing to look up on Wikipedia with that fancy phone of yours. End result is this: the federal government is much expanded, and many agencies like the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and Social Security are spawned and remain in place today. This helps lessen the impact of the poor being poor in cities and the farmers going through the Dust Bowl, and acts as a way for the country to try its best and recover just in time to go back to war. 'Cause, thing is, when you leave Europe to dissolve into chaos and a war-torn, debt-ridden mess, you get fascism. You want to know how you get foreign problems? By not solving the original problems, which, if you'll remember, is exactly what America did after World War I. So now, FDR slowly gets America involved by starting a gun-running operation with the Brits via Destroyers for Bases and Lend-Lease Acts, eventually getting America involved completely after the Japanese surprise motherfucker Pearl Harbor, and the isolationists can't say we're not involved anymore. We then proceed to imprison Japanese Americans and arrest people for anti-war speech, and curb stomp fascism and Japanese imperialism with our soon-to-be enemies, the USSR, and our friends the British, with two uses of the cheat known as the atomic bomb. Women now have economic independence because the men went off to war, and the women took their jobs to build munitions for the gun-running operation, which will be lost and then slowly regained over the course of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, women are almost equal now. We're getting there. After the success of the massive gun-running operation known as World War II, America went on to use its new funds for bigger and better things, namely containing communism. With the implementation of the Marshall Plan to fund European rebuilding and the Truman Doctrine of telling commies to go away with the threat of nuclear force, the Cold War, with all of its end-of-the-world threats and CIA meddling, would begin. An iron curtain was drawn between the West and East, and Senator McCarthy spearheads a new effort to find communists at home, similar to the Salem witch trials. And we go to Korea to contain the North Koreans, because democracy! Eisenhower, the American general war hero, is the next president, and he continues the Cold War with a brinksmanship policy where we say, we are literally this close to nuking you. And the creation of NASA and education funding once we realized the Soviets sent a metal ball into space before we did. Brown v. Board of Education happens, giving legal credence to racial equality and integration, eventually leading to federal troops enforcing education integration in Alabama, and a civil rights movement beginning that would culminate in the 60s, as the 50s sets up the beginnings of more liberal minds and opinions, with people like beatniks and stuff. And so, here we are at the 60s. Counterculture, LSD, rock and roll, along with the Cuban Missile Crisis and students protesting everything from denial of free speech to the Vietnam War. JFK is popular and then gets assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson takes his place and starts to implement a great society with a war on poverty. The Civil Rights Bill gets passed, Vietnam exposes the horrors of fighting in the jungle to the American people, and Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy get assassinated. A lot of assassinations. Civil rights movement goes from a peaceful protest movement that would get the Civil Rights Bill passed to a violent defense movement and proceeds to lose traction, while a conservative movement led by Barry Goldwater starts to grow and grow. Women are slowly getting more rights, with feminist movements growing and Roe v. Wade deeming abortion to be legal, and now we're getting into the 70s, while Nixon implemented liberal policies before getting kicked out due to Watergate, with Ford continuing Nixon's previous efforts of negotiating with the Chinese and Soviets in the policy of détente throughout Vietnam, falling entirely to the communist North. After Ford came Carter, who would go on to blame the country's energy problems on Americans not being conservative with their oil and negotiating peace in Israel for at least a little while. Our energy crisis being caused by OPEC denying us oil. He was also in charge during the period of stagflation, where there was both massive unemployment and inflation, which leads to no fun for anyone. A brand new conservative movement, spearheaded by the likes of Phyllis Schlafly and the Moral Majority, would prevent the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and push forward the election of the great communicator known as Ronald Reagan. With Reagan's election, the country would be headed for an upturn economically and morally, and the Cold War would come to its end, scaring the Soviets into overspending with a strategic defense initiative nicknamed Star Wars and signing a missile treaty with the rather liberal Soviet Prime Minister Gorbachev. Eventually, the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR fell apart. His introduction of supply-side economics would lead to a decrease in taxes, but this was also followed by a massive increase in military spending that would blow up the US deficit, putting us in some deep debt. Other 80s news includes new movies, TV, and music, the Christian Coalition symbolizing the Christian political force growing, Native Americans are starting casinos, and AIDS came in, and was probably ignored because it started in the gay community. After Reagan was the 90s, with Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton leading the nation through an era defined by new threats, globalization of the economy, and computers. Bush would pass a Clean Air Act, defend Kuwait with an Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm for oil, because we don't want oil from Iraq taking over Kuwait, and begin negotiations for a North American Free Trade Agreement, so that we can be buddy-buddies with Mexico and Canada. However, he was also terrible at domestic policy, implementing new taxes after stating, "Read my lips, no new taxes," shortly before his election. After him was Bill Clinton, who pissed off both political sides by balancing the federal budget and signing off on NAFTA, and did his best to be a political moderate, straddling both conservative and liberal viewpoints, and helped with some peace efforts in East Europe as well as Ireland. Terrorism is starting to become a thing, and Clinton has to deal with trying to say, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," though since the economy was doing great, a lot of Americans looked the other way. The internet is finally becoming a thing, with Apple, Microsoft, and Google bringing the World Wide Web into people's homes. Finally, the last decade or so. After barely winning the election in Bush v. Gore, Bush then shepherds the nation through 9/11 by declaring a war on terror and getting us involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. He implemented a No Child Left Behind policy, ensuring that every kid in the United States would get very well acquainted with standardized testing, and passed the Patriot Act so that the NSA could collect all of your communications data. Hurricane Katrina/Tortilla hit like a truck and devastated the southern coast, while FEMA was unequipped to handle the issue. Banks made risky investments, which led to the Great Recession of 2008 whenever those investments failed, and eventually Obama would become elected. And as for him, he passed the Affordable Care Act and did a bunch of other stuff that you might remember from your recent life memories. And so, we get to the present. Thank you for listening, and good night.